The most famous thing Sultan Ibrahim ever did, he almost certainly never did. The story is that in one afternoon of jealous rage, he had hundreds of the women of his harem sewn into weighted sacks and dropped into the Bosphorus. It follows him through every listicle and every lazy retelling, the single image that fixes him in the popular memory as a monster. And there is not one Ottoman chronicle that records it. Not Mustafa Naima, not Khatib Celebi, who was alive while it supposedly happened. Even the number cannot keep its story straight, which is what you get from a rumour rather than a head count. This is the man history files under the most perverted sultan who ever sat a throne. Most of what earned him that title was written by the people who strangled him. Here is the shape of the life before the legend gets its hands on it. Ibrahim came to the throne in 1640 and was dead by August 1648. 8 years. He spent most of his youth locked inside a few rooms of Topkapi Palace, was then handed an empire he had never been trained to run, and was finally throttled with a bowstring by men who had decided he had to go. That is the arc. Everything lurid you have heard gets bolted onto that frame afterward, and most of it falls off the moment you touch it. Start with the rooms, because the rooms explain the man. The Ottomans kept a place inside Topkapi they called the Kafes, which translates, without any softening, to the cage. From 1617 onward, this is where spare princes were kept. Before that, the house had a blunter method. A new sultan would have his brothers killed on the day he took power, so that no rival could grow up to challenge him. The cage was the reform, the supposedly humane alternative. In practice, it swapped a quick death for a slow erasure. A young prince could spend years, sometimes the better part of a lifetime, sealed in windowless quarters, cut off from the world, waited on by servants who had been deliberately deafened and muted so that no message and no conversation could pass. No tutors, no news of the empire he might one day inherit. Ibrahim grew up in that silence under his half-brother Murad IV, never sure which morning would bring the order for his own death. You do not need a medical degree to guess what that does to a person. He watched the men ahead of him in the succession die. He understood, in the plainest way anyone understands anything, that his own survival was a clerical oversight that could be corrected at any hour. The secondary accounts say his mother, Kosem Sultan, made a particular case to Murad to keep him breathing, that Ibrahim was too damaged to be a threat to anyone, and killing off the last male heir would end the dynasty for nothing. That anecdote is repeated everywhere and traced to no named chronicle, so hold it at arm's length. But the shape of it is plausible and bleak. His life may have depended on convincing the court he was harmless, which is to say on performing the very incapacity that would later be turned into the case against him. Murad IV died in 1640. He had been the last hard hand on the empire, a ruler who frightened his own court, and he died without a surviving son. That left Ibrahim, the brother in the cage, as the only living Ottoman male. An empire on 3 continents came down to one traumatized man in a sealed room. When they came to tell him he was Sultan, the story goes, he would not open the door. He was certain it was a trick, that the men outside had come to kill him the way men had come for his brothers, and that the word Sultan was simply the bait on the hook. The retold version has Kosem spelling out the choice for him as the throne or the grave. That exact scene cannot be pinned to a primary source, so treat the dialogue as folklore. What holds is that his mother put him on the throne and that he took it in terror. The empire he inherited was not a small machine to operate. It ran on viziers and tax farmers, and the janissary corps and the religious hierarchy, a system a man raised in a windowless room had no equipment to read. Kosem stayed close and stayed powerful. For a while it held together. Then comes the story that turned him into a monster, so let me take it apart because it is the load-bearing wall of the whole reputation, and it is built on sand. The claim is the drowned harem. Ibrahim, in a fit of jealousy, ordering every woman in his harem sewn into a sack and rowed out and dropped hundreds of them in a single day. Trace it back, and it does not lead to a chronicle at all. It leads to modern writing. The trail ends at a 2012 Smithsonian piece by Mike Dash, and a 2014 book by Ilhan Niaz called Old World Empires. Neither is an Ottoman source. Neither cites an Ottoman source that says it happened. Even the Wikipedia entry that passes the tale along hedges it, noting that several historians reject the story as invented or exaggerated, and the only authorities it can name for that rejection are those same two modern writers. Then there is the arithmetic, which gives the whole thing away. A real atrocity with real witnesses tends to leave behind a stable number. This one does not. Most tellings settle on 280 women. One account says 278. That gap of 2 is meaningless if you're inventing a horror and damning if you're supposed to be reporting one, because nobody drowns that many people and comes back with a figure that drifts. Time magazine, in one of its history listicles, prints the story as flat fact and cites precisely nothing. And ExecutedToday.com, a site that does not usually flinch from something grisly, adds the honest note that the tale may be the slander of the enemies who eventually brought him down. If you want the cleanest sign that the drowning is smoke, look at the one consort we can actually document. Her name was Zafire Hatun. She was given to Ibrahim by the chief eunuch. She bore him a son around 1642, and she died in Malta of causes that had nothing to do with him and nothing to do with any sack in the Bosphorus. A real, traceable woman from his harem, a natural death abroad, and no drowning anywhere near her. The legend wants a river full of murdered women. The record hands back one woman who died of ordinary causes in Malta. The scale of the appetite, which is really what the phrase most perverted sultan is selling, shrinks the moment anyone counts. Popular retellings give him hundreds of concubines and a hunger with no flaw. The documented number of his Haseki sultans, the consorts raised to formal rank, is 7 by Evliya Celebi's count, or 8 if you follow the historian Ahmed Refik. 7 or 8 women given standing at court is normal harem arithmetic, not the signature of some singular derangement. We even know a couple of them by name and by thoroughly boring outcomes. Zafire Hatun was pushed out of the harem after Ibrahim's fall, and, by Evliya's telling, remarried and got on with the rest of her life. Standing, exile, a second marriage, a life resumed. The record keeps handing us mundane women where the legend promised a bottomless appetite. The second pillar of his depravity is stranger, and in its way funnier. The Sable Fur Obsession. The story goes that Ibrahim loved sable so much he demanded the palace be draped in it, wanted the very walls furred, and let fortunes and even the war effort bleed out to feed his craving for the pelts. It is unhinged enough to be memorable, which is probably why it lodged. In 2026, an Ottomanist named Gündoğdu published an article in the journal Mukademe that did the dull, decisive thing nobody bothers to do with a good story. Went into the fiscal registers and the imperial decrees and looked at where sable actually appears. It appears exactly where sable appears in any Ottoman court, in ceremony and diplomacy, robes of honour and gifts to foreign envoys, the everyday stagecraft of a state that used costly fur the way other states used gold plate. It does not appear as the fingerprint of one man's private mania. Gündoğdu's conclusion is flat. The famous sable obsession does not match the patterns of what the Sultan actually demanded. The single most repeated proof that Ibrahim was a deranged sensualist turns out, under the light, to be a court doing its paperwork. Which brings us to the nickname, and the nickname is carrying more weight than any fact underneath it. In Turkish he is Deli Ibrahim, Mad Ibrahim, and most people assume that label is as old as his corpse. It is not. The branding of him as Deli Ibrahim is credited to Ahmed Refik Altinay, a historian working in the 20th century, roughly 300 years after the man was dead. Refik is the same writer who handed popular history 2 of its other favourite Ottoman phrases, the reign of women and the sable era. Follow that thread. One historian, working in the 1900s, coined the shorthand for the Mad Sultan, the shorthand for the period when the harem supposedly ran the state, and the shorthand for the fur decadence, and all 3 have been repeated ever since as though they were contemporary verdicts rather than one man's catchy branding. He was good at labels. The trouble is that a label is not a diagnosis, and a 20th century phrasemaker is a strange chain of custody for a claim about a 17th century man's sanity. The historians who actually work on the reign are split, and they split in a direction worth noticing. Scott Rank, an Ottomanist, points out that the tales of Ibrahim's lunacy were circulated by his political opponents, and that a fair number of scholars read him as inept rather than insane, which are very different accusations. His surviving handwritten correspondence shows a man dealing, in plain rational terms, with the things a ruler has to deal with. Gündoğdu presses further, and this is the strongest form of the argument. The marginal notes and decrees and fiscal records that survive show steady attention to the coinage, to emergency taxation, to keeping the provinces fed and public order intact. That is not the paper trail of a raving man. The article's core claim is that the portrait of Ibrahim as irrational and incapable was assembled after his deposition in 1648, out of factional score settling and the ordinary habits of chroniclers writing to flatter the winners, and that plain governance disputes hardened, over generations, into moral verdicts about his mind. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to sprint the other way and turn Ibrahim into a misunderstood reformer, and the evidence does not support that either. Gundodu is not claiming he ruled well or even competently. The narrower point is the one that survives scrutiny. The surviving administration reads like an administration, and the wild man of the legend does not show up in the documents Ibrahim actually left behind. There is even a modern piece in Daily Sabah that swaps madness for medicine, cataloguing headaches and nervous seizures, and heart palpitations and fainting spells, and a possible brain tumour as an explanation for erratic behaviour. It is a reasonable idea. The sourcing under it is thin, so I will not sell it to you as settled. The honest position is smaller than the legend and smaller than the rescue. The drowned harem and the sable are the two big load-bearing myths, but the legend never travels alone, and the rest of the pile falls apart on the same terms. The retellings have him ripping the infant Mehmed out of his mother's arms and hurling the baby into a palace cistern, a scene that collapses the instant anyone looks for a source. They have him hiring a sorcerer, a man remembered as Chinti Hoka, to cure an impotence the accounts cannot actually establish he had. They have Kosem herself combing the city for women to satisfy an appetite the earlier legend already inflated past all counting. Test them one by one and each comes apart the same way. No source at all, or a source that turns out to be a modern retelling quoting another modern retelling, or specifics that contradict the little we can actually document. It is a reputation assembled entirely out of things that either did not happen or cannot be shown to have happened. So what did the reign actually consist of, if not drowned harems and fur mania? A great deal of it was a war Ibrahim did not exactly choose. On 28th September 1644, 6 galleys of the Knights Hospitaller fell on a rich Ottoman galleon and its escort in the water south of Rhodes, and after a long fight took the prize. Among the captives, by some accounts, was a boy said to be Ibrahim's own son, a claim that was already disputed in the period and should stay disputed now. Then the Hospitallers did the thing that turned a piracy at sea into a war on land. They put in at Crete, which belonged to Venice. That single stop on Venetian soil handed the Ottomans a pretext and they seized it. The Cretan War was on. The fighting threw off the kind of episode chroniclers love because chroniclers love a siege. At Rethymno, on Crete, the Ottomans under Ghazi Hussein Pasha came down on a garrison of about 1,200 defenders under the Venetian commander Luigi Minotto, and between 11 October and 13 November 1646 they took it. The larger prize was the fortress city of Candia, and Candia is where the war became an epic in its own right. That siege opened on May 1st, 1648, and did not lift until September 27th, 1669, 21 years later, one of the longest sieges anyone has ever endured. Popular retellings like to drape that whole ordeal over Ibrahim as though he presided over decades of grinding war. He did not. The siege of Candia began in the final months of his reign. He had about 3 months left to live when the first shot struck its walls. Wars are paid for with taxes, and the taxes are where the reign came apart. His Grand Vizier for the last stretch was Hizapare Ahmed Pasha, in office from September 1647, and Ahmed Pasha funded the fighting the direct way by squeezing everyone within reach. Squeezing works about as well as it ever does on a capital already sick of its sultan. By the summer of 1648, the pressure had nowhere left to go. On August 8th, a mob got hold of Ahmed Pasha and tore him to pieces in the street, and that same day the two bodies that could actually unmake a sultan, the Janissary Corps and the religious establishment, moved on Ibrahim and put him under lock. They did it by the rules, which in the Ottoman system meant securing a ruling first. The Grand Vizier who stepped into the wreckage, Sofu Mehmed Pasha, obtained a fatwa from the Shaykhul Islam, the highest religious authority in the empire, sanctioning the removal. The justification was an old principle of the house, that if there are 2 caliphs, one of them has to be put to death. So a deposed sultan left breathing is a permanent danger to the one on the throne. Kosem, the mother who had lifted him out of the cage and set him on the throne, consented to the deposition and then, by the accounts, consented with grief to the killing. On August 18th, 1648, Ibrahim was strangled with a cord. He is said to have begged for his life at the end. That was 10 days after the mob finished Ahmed Pasha, not the same afternoon, whatever the neater versions want. The throne passed to his 6-year-old son, who became Mehmed IV, born at Topkapi in January 1642, to a consort named Ilhan Niaz, a woman of Russian or Ruthenian origin, and here the court broke its own rule. Kosem, the grandmother, was installed as regent over the boy, above Turhan, his actual mother, on the grounds that Turhan was too young and untried for the work. The sources note it plainly as contrary to Ottoman custom. The woman who had engineered Ibrahim's rise and outlived his fall simply went on running the empire through the next child in the line. Now, if you're wondering how a documentary can knock down this much and still not tell you what Ibrahim was truly like from day to day, the answer sits with the question of who stood close enough to write it down, and the answer is almost nobody usable. Mustafa Naima, whose chronicle is the standard narrative for the era, was born in 1655, 7 years after Ibrahim was already dead. His account of the reign is history assembled after the fact, not testimony from the room. Evliya Celebi did live through all 8 years, a genuine contemporary and one of the sharpest minds of the century, and he wrote a work that runs right up to 1648, but it is a chronological table, terse dated entries of who ruled and who was appointed, the kind of thing that would never stop to record a sultan's private conduct. Evliya Celebi, the great traveller, gets quoted second-hand by modern writers for small factual scraps, his count of the favoured consorts, a note that one of them remarried later. But the vivid line people love to hang on him, about Ibrahim being addicted to lust and spending all his hours in pleasure, is not a real Evliya quote. It does not survive checking, and the Venetian ambassadors, whose dispatches from Istanbul in exactly these years would be the outside witness anyone would want, sit untranslated in an archive this research could not reach. The record where the depravity ought to live is either too late, too terse, or locked away in a language nobody pulled it out of. That silence did the real work. No chronicler wrote down a river of drowned women because, as far as anyone can show, there was no river. The sable turns out to be court furniture, nothing stranger. The madness only enters the record after the men who removed him needed a reason for the cord, and a phrasemaker 3 centuries later handed their monster its name. Fill 8 thinly documented years with rumour and factional revenge and you get exactly the Ibrahim we inherited. And the atrocity that supposedly proves how far gone he was cannot agree with itself on how many women it killed. 280 in most tellings, 278 in another. You do not lose count of a massacre, you lose count of a rumour. The name outlived everything true about him. He is still Deli Ibrahim in the textbooks, still the sex-mad tyrant in the clickbait, still the man who drowned his harem in whatever the algorithm serves up next. Turkish outlets like Daily Sabah and Turkey Today run their tidy retrospectives, the silken noose, the portrait in a series of mighty sovereigns, and the television version of the court, built around his mother Kosem, hands the character to a fresh audience every few years. The scholarship that complicates all of it, Gundodu's registers, Scott Rank's divided verdict, sits where such scholarship usually sits, unread by the people repeating the story. He has spent the centuries since his strangling as a cautionary cartoon, and almost none of the cartoon can be sourced.